the tools. And the experience and all the experience we will be mentioning. Okay, I think the live stream restarted. Okay, maybe should I restart? Okay. Sorry about that, technical problems. I'm gonna start all over again. So, hi, I'm Kostas from Veridise. I'm the CTO, and I have Sankara, who is the Chief Research Officer at Veridise. So a little bit of background for us. We are a security firm that does a lot of security reviews in the Web3 space, and we also develop security tools, which we offer through a platform called Audit Hub. So for the remainder of the talk, whenever you hear about like automated tools, this will be hosted in Audit Hub, and all of the experience we'll be mentioning from engagements will come from our experiences with doing reviews as part of our consulting service through Veridise. So today's webinar is going to focus on kind of like, what actually works when we want to do continuous security in the Web3 space. And along the way, we'll also be sharing some kind of like tidbits of like, what doesn't work sometime. So I'm going to start the presentation with a little bit of background and kind of like, how the landscape, the security landscape in Web3 has changed recently. Then I will pass it on to Sankara to present some of kind of like real use cases and case studies we have done. And then we're going to close it with some remarks at the end. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. We're going to have some time towards the end to answer them. And without further ado, let's go on with the presentation. So let's first open things on how security, the security landscape has evolved in Web3. So before 2026, we were in a regime where security was kind of like a point-in-time exercise. And what I mean by that is that most teams would have like a phase where they will develop, then they will freeze certain features, they will hire a bunch of auditors to review their protocol. After the review process, they will fix whatever the auditors pointed out, and then they will just like deploy. So that was the majority of the teams. Some teams had like more advanced like security practices, but like here I'm talking about the majority of the protocol teams. So moving forward to 2026, when we have AI, that is kind of like a game changer and is gonna kind of like dominate a little bit of the discussion moving forward. Doing this point-in-time security doesn't work anymore because AI has kind of like reduced the barrier to generate exploits. And so we now see kind of like a shift to more continuous security, and this is going to be kind of like the focus of the rest of the presentation. And so along that, it's also kind of like interesting to see what's the root cause of this sudden rise in exploits. So first of all, AI acted as a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it helped teams expedite their timelines. Now features became more cheap to develop. And so the time from like, starting to deployment got compressed. However, on the other side of the sword, it also magnified the asymmetry between defenders and attackers. And what we mean by that is that a defender must find every vulnerability in their code base in order to be secure, whereas an attacker only needs one exploit and like now AI has made it way cheaper to detect this vulnerability and then exploit it. And also because this transition requires a change in mindset from moving from point-in-time security to continuous validation. This can take time for teams to implement, and so that's why we see that security teams are currently lagging a little bit behind attackers, and the numbers kind of show them because the number of vulnerabilities and exploits have been increased specifically at the first half of this year. So the main takeaway to remember from this slide is no matter what you do, you will always be as secure as your weakest link, right? So if you invested for your house in the best, most secure door, if your window is broken, you are vulnerable, right? So the goal of the rest of the talk will be to kind of help you create a framework that will guide you on how to evaluate your security practices, and then at the end we're going to present a checklist that you can have in mind, while you're going through the different development phases. Okay, so now, since we saw kind of the problem, let's see what are the available options development teams have in their disposal these days. First of all, we have the traditional manual auditing, where involves human experts that they can kind of go into your code base, assess its security, and kind of see what can go wrong. So the benefits of such an approach is that humans have kind of deep expertise, and they can also kind of infer what is missing from your security practices, and kind of help you introduce more checks, and also find vulnerabilities as they go over the code base. However, they have of course certain defects. One being that they only look at your code base for a limited time window, and also they are in nature non-deterministic, right? Even if you get the same human with the same code base in different circumstances, they're not gonna have exactly the same result, right? You might have a bad day, you might miss something, or you may have a very good day and then find everything. And also another downside, of course, is cost, because humans are kind of costly to hire, and have dedicated time to look at your code base. So the second solution that gains popularity, especially this year, is AI scanners that essentially they are looking at your code base. They get some additional input from you, like your threat model, your security, your threat model, and your architecture overview, and then they kind of come back with bugs that you can resolve. So there, the benefit is that they're very convenient, right? You just need to point them to your code base, and then they come back with bugs. But they also have downsides, and here specifically the downside is that even though in theory they can find a wide variety of bugs, it doesn't mean that they will always find them. And then also in order to be used efficiently, you have to kind of point them into your code base in a very targeted manner. So efficiency here kind of matters. It's not that you can spend an enormous amount of tokens and you will guarantee that you will find the bugs. You have to spend your tokens wisely. And the other downside is that they also lack formal guarantees. It doesn't mean that if the scanner came back with no bugs, that the code base is bug free. First of all, they are non-deterministic, so they do share this human trait, since they're trained in our image. So it doesn't mean that every time you run the AI scanner with the same input, you will get like the same output. And also, you need to kind of like, run these things until like you reach a fixed point of like, where you cannot find any more vulnerabilities. And because they are non-deterministic, it's hard to know whether you reach a fixed point or not. And like, talking with like several of our clients, this is their main concern, is whether the AI scanner found all the vulnerabilities, or if a new, more capable model down the line will find more vulnerabilities in the code base. And finally, we have traditional security tools. These are things like static analyzers, verifiers, and fuzzers. So their benefit is that they are more deterministic, with the exception of fuzzers. So with the same input, they most commonly will return the same output. And their other benefit that they have is that they can guarantee the absence of bug classes. And we will see later on that if you're interested in kind of eliminating the worry of a specific bug class, you gonna need to use a traditional security tool. And the other benefit that they have is that they are most of them run in cheaper hardware, so you can get more checks out of them with a more limited budget than an AI scanner. However, they do require some knowledge and expertise in order to set them up, and it requires some human to kind of operate them and set them up. So they do have this additional hidden cost. All right, so let's now go and see how most of the teams were kind of utilizing all of these tools pre 2016. And if you think of the development process as kind of going through a design, implementation and testing, and validation and deployment, security was being pushed all the way to the right. So it was very rare for teams to kind of consider security during the design phase. They will use some traditional security tooling and mainly testing while implementing stuff. Then they will freeze, get a bunch of auditors to evaluate the security of their protocol, and then they will deploy, and then they'll kind of rely on monitoring systems to alert them if something goes wrong. So it wasn't ideal even back then. We will be even then we were kind of we and other security teams were pushing for teams to kind of integrate security teams more into their development process, but it got us where we are now. However, beginning of this year, things changed drastically, because generating exploits became way cheaper. And what's the solution here is kind of turning the direction of the arrow and pushing security to the left. So the most cheapest way to fix a bug is by not introducing it in your code base at all. So you start at the design phase, and you start kind of leveraging both humans, internal and external, to your protocol, and AI to kind of see whether your design enforces certain critical invariants of your system. Then during the development of your protocol, you can use both traditional security solutions and AI scanners to help you identify bugs as early as possible, because identifying a bug early is the cheapest time to fix it. And there you can kind of use these two solutions in a complementary way. So for example, because AI scanners tend to be a little bit more expensive to run, and even if tokens become cheaper, there is an endless kind of checklist of things that you need to check, so you have to do a lot of work regardless. So you can have kind of like things that you are very worried about and can be checked with a traditional tool like a static analyzer or a verifier. You assign them like, there, and you make sure that like, every change in your code base go through there. And then for more high level, like, bugs that require a little bit more context and kind of like, the business logic of your protocol, you use AI scanners. And then even when an AI scanner generates something, you can also see if that check can be encoded with a traditional tool, and then you introduce that check, so you have like the peace of mind that if a violation arises in the future, the traditional tool will catch it. And finally, like, at the validation, you kind of like, stick with a human expert that can assess your securities. And there, instead of like having the security expert mainly focus on kind of like identifying vulnerabilities in your code base, you also ask them to kind of like assess their security practices as a whole. And this is where kind of like, the benefit of having a human pays out, because they're very good at, first of all, identifying gaps. And second of all, they have the domain expertise to tell you which other tools will be useful for your infrastructure and help you kind of like, encode that checks. And finally, when you go to deployment, you can keep leveraging traditional tools like, fuzzers and monitoring systems. And here we tend to tell to people to prefer proactive solutions over reactive, because it's better to be notified about something that might go wrong before it actually gets exploited. All right, so to close up, like, what the main point we try to make here is that teams need to utilize each of these tools to close security gaps. And as I mentioned earlier, each of these approaches have certain pros and cons. So you need to kind of like leverage the best tool to kind of like, cover the bugs that it is more suited to detect. All right, so now I'm gonna transition here and pass it to Sankara, where he's gonna give us some lessons we learned from our own experience of kind of like combining AI scanners with formal verification tools. He will show us how we leverage specifically a verifier with AI capabilities to kind of like expedite our ability to verify things and also find bugs. One thing to note here, the case studies Sankara is going to show us are going to be targeted in the ZK domain, mainly because that's the domain of expertise of Sankara. But like all of these things do generalize to DeFi protocols as well. And if you want to see the capability of our DeFi tools in terms of like, bug finding capability, feel free to check our blog post on the Audit Hub webpage. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Sankara, where he will show us the real case studies.
Thanks, Kostas. So the first example comes from our work with ZKM. So ZKM develops an open source MIPS-based ZKVM, and we were using our tool Picus, which is a formal verification tool, to check the determinism of their ZK circuits. So at a high level, Picus and any verifier really gives you one of two meaningful answers. So either the property is verified, or it gives you a counterexample showing the property doesn't hold. And so in our situation, the circuits that we were analyzing were quite large, and the counterexamples could have hundreds of reference variables. And manually looking through any counterexample could take several minutes, so something like 30 minutes to an hour per counterexample. And so while the verification itself is kind of fully automated, the bottleneck started becoming understanding the root cause of all these counterexamples. And so, next slide, please. And so essentially what we tried doing was taking the output of our verifier Picus and giving those counterexamples to Codex. And I'm not saying Codex here is anything special, but compared to something like Claude, but instead of having an engineer manually trace these values through the circuit, Codex would inspect the counterexample along with the code and try to identify the actual root cause. And obviously we would, confirm whatever root cause it would say manually. And so this is the kind of screenshot here. It sort of shows all the different, these are all issues that Codex ended up identifying, which were like missing constraints and non-deterministic transitions. And they were all kind of confirmed by the developer. And so the point here is not any sort of individual bug, but it's that AI was taking something produced by our verifier and making that output dramatically easier for people to act on. And so in the next slide, I will talk about, I think this is my more general kind of view here, is that AI is a very good at detecting root cause. And this is not just for formal verification, but if we look at formal verification, it's very good at answering a question like, does this property hold or not, right? And when it doesn't, it gives you a counterexample, but a counterexample is not really the same thing as an explanation. It might tell you, 150 variables can take on certain values, but without telling you which line of code is actually wrong. And we found basically that AI is very good at the second problem, taking a complex counterexample, mapping it onto code, and then actually proposing a root cause for the issue. And then the nice thing is that then you can apply that fix, rerun your verifier, and then see, okay, does the property actually hold now? And so this is kind of leads into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is how can AI sort of help with automating the rest of the formal verification workflow? Because it's not just about running the verifier, there's several steps here. So normally, when you're doing formal verifications, the first step is you have to figure out what type of properties you want to prove. And then you need to translate the system. So it may be written in some high-level language, but you need to translate it into some form that your verifier understands. So verifiers typically operate on their own languages. And then you run the verification, inspect the failures, refine your specification, and then iterate. So either the verifier returns, let's say it verified the property, found a bug, but that could also be that your spec was wrong. And so this ends up being a big sort of loop where there's this fair amount of human engineering effort that goes into each step. And so we wanted to try out how much of these different steps in the formal verification workflow can an AI agent drive, and while still having the verifier be our source of truth. And so I'm going to show like an example of where kind of a situation where we actually tried this in the next slide. To test this, we picked systems that we had never audited before. So these were two open source RISC-V ZKVMs, which is Ceno and Pico. And so we essentially gave Codex access to the code and had it identify some specifications that our tool Picus could check. So these are Picus checks determinism, but it can also check some custom properties. We had it look into the code, identify the kind of circuit language that it was using, translate those circuit constraints into a Picus's verification language, and then run Picus. So it was basically acting like an engineer orchestrating the whole verification process while Picus was kind of doing the actual verification. And so through this process, just kind of letting it run on its own, it was able to find 7 critical bugs across the two systems, 5 in Ceno and then 2 in Pico. And to us, that was, I think, a pretty strong demonstration that it isn't just kind of like, this is pretty actionable and usable for real systems. And I think like the AI agents are able to kind of automate something that would have taken a formal verification engineer probably several days of work. So I'll show you an example of one of the bugs that it found. This came from the shift circuit, so one of the shift circuits in Ceno. So on the left are the actual, are like kind of a subset of the relevant constraints enforced by the circuit, and on the right is the intended specification. So the spec is basically saying O is less than P when reduced to the field, and so you can't natively express comparisons in ZK circuits. And so the important detail here is that these values kind of live all in a finite field. So the arithmetic frequently wraps around a prime. And so at first glance, the constraints essentially should look like the enforce the intended computation. Basically what it's saying, trying to do is it's saying if P215 is greater than O, then P215 minus O is greater than 0. And it does this by kind of range constraining the difference to lie within a 32-bit value, and range constraining one of the P215 to also be a 32-bit value. But the spec here actually doesn't hold, and Picus found a counterexample. So you don't really need to follow all the like kind of arithmetic, but the key idea is that Picus chose P215 to be 0, and then but it chose O to be like a really, really large field element, so that when you subtracted O from P, it wrapped around and then fell back into this constrained range of 32 bits. And so all the constraints are satisfied, but the intended integer comparison is false because O is now like a very large value. And so the fix here was pretty simple. It just, you also want to make sure that O is also a 32-bit value. And what I kind of like about this example is it kind of captures the whole workflow. The AI identified the property, which is this comparison. It set up the verification, translated to Picus, and then Picus gave us a counterexample. The AI actually proposed a very concrete root cause and fix, and then actually after adding this missing constraint, Picus verified the determinism. So it sort of shows like the full loop of the AI agent driving the verification workflow. And so those are the two kind of examples I wanted to convey.
All right, thank you, Sankara. And so, like, yeah, that brings us to kind of like, closing the presentation pretty soon, and then we're gonna answer some of the questions that people have asked already. So even though, like, what Sankara presented was kind of like, a point in time, it shows how these things can essentially run in a loop and essentially convert these checks into continuous security. So just to sum up what we discussed today, first, we need to make sure that, like, we start security as early as possible in our development process, and the earliest you can do is like while you're designing the system. Then once you figure out what things you want to check, you need to start having automations in place. You need to scan your code base like regularly as new commits arrive, and you also need to make sure that like these checks are also informed automatically by including them into your CI/CD pipeline, and also start like having extensive testing and fuzzing suites. And lastly, you also need to make sure that like all of these things that fits into this infrastructure always stays current. You need to also kind of like have some time dedicated to evaluate your automations and refine them, and also recheck whether the design in your threat model has actually drifted from what is actually being implemented. And so, yeah, if we want to close with like one sentence here, you need to choose to go proactive over reactive when it comes to security. And in order to make sure that you always secure your weakest link, combine experts with AI and traditional tooling to close every gap. All right, that's all we had for you today. I think we have time for a couple of questions. So I think I'm gonna start really quickly with this one that says, at which time in your development you should start integrating security automations in your CI/CD pipeline. So the answer here, and like I think I hinted to that earlier, is as soon as possible, right? Like making sure that things run automatically as new commits land is very crucial. Yeah, I think we have like one more specific question about what do we fit into context, and I think that question landed while Sankara was talking about the case studies, so I'm gonna throw that to you, Sankara.
Oh yeah, so we did create some skills to, particularly about that target verification language, which is what Picus uses, but we actually didn't really provide a lot of like ZK specific skills. Like what was interesting is that the codex was able to kind of just on its own understand how the constraint system worked, and then it just needed to map that onto sort of the target verification language. But at least in the source, it seems like it was able to kind of figure this out. The prompts were also pretty simple. Like we gave it some context about what obviously what the projects were, what they were trying to do, some kind of common properties that need to be checked about ZK circuits, but otherwise no specific skills. And so, I mean, obviously with more skills, you should be able to expect, the AI agents doing a better job.
All right, thank you. And one last question is whether AI can detect vulnerabilities that traditional static analysis and fuzzing tools miss. So the answer there is, of course. AI is very good at kind of like, understanding part of the business logic of the protocol, and then by analyzing the implementation and pulling things into its context, it can very easily see if something can be essentially exploited. But also the crucial part to kind of mention here is that if there is a class of bugs that the static analyzer and the fuzzing tool can also find, you still need somebody to set it up. And then if you kind of can convert what AI found into kind of a check that the static analyzer or the fuzzing tool can do, you can run the more traditional tools to kind of find it. And as Sankara mentioned earlier, you can even use AI to do the setup. All right, I think we have one more question, so let's answer it, and I think then we can close. Then the question is, how should teams validate automated findings to not waste time on false positives? I think Sankara kind of hinted at that while he was presenting the counter example generated by Picus, and whether it can be exploited and whether it is a real bug or not. So there is where AI thrives, because you present it with the automated finding, and then you ask AI to kind of determine its exploitability. And that also helps even if the automated finding comes from an AI system to begin with, because the automated system might have look at the protocol from a specific angle and might have been missing some additional context, then you can have kind of like a triager or a validator that asks ask if given this automated finding, can this be exploited? All right, I think we cover all of the questions. Thank you all for joining, and yeah, if you have any other questions, either for me, Sankara, or anybody in the team, feel free to reach to us through all of our social media, and we'll make sure to kind of get back to you as soon as possible. And that's all I have for you today.